hatred and self-love, how do we switch from not loving ourselves to loving ourselves? So it's really sad. There's this tragedy today, actually, of a lot of us thinking that self-love is somehow self-indulgent, that it's ego-filled, or it's arrogant, or it's not spiritual, or it's not humble. And so on the spiritual path, you get a lot of people who say, oh no, don't love yourself so much. Realize you're nothing. And here's what's interesting. The teaching of realize you're nothing and loving the self are actually the same when we deeply understand them. So it's not that one is right or one is wrong. The only piece that's wrong is when we don't properly understand either, and in the misunderstanding of both of them, we get both of them wrong. So our humility becomes self-deprecation. It becomes I'm worthless, I'm stupid, I'm unworthy, not good enough, not smart enough, not pure enough, not this enough, not that enough. And it becomes almost a sense of low-grade depression, a sort of checking out of life. I'm nothing, not worthy, not good enough. And so either we actually fall deeply into despair, or we fall into this sort of low-grade apathy, indifference to life. Now, that's not on either level, on any level, where we're supposed to go. Here's what the I am nothing looks like. One way of thinking about it. Say you have a glass of air, a glass jar of air. Imagine that you've got a glass jar, screw on top, and it's screwed on. You've got a glass full of air. Okay? Now imagine you drop that glass and it breaks. What do you have? Now what do you have? Had a glass jar of air, now my glass jar broke. What do I have? Nothing, right? Well, that's absolutely one way of looking at it. Yeah, I had a glass jar of air, now my glass jar broke, I have nothing. There's also another way of looking at it. Everything. I used to have a glass jar of air. Now the jar broke. Now I've got nothing but air. Two different ways of describing the exact same phenomena. Neither is wrong, neither is right. But it's important to realize they are describing the exact same phenomenon. So when we say I am nothing, it's the jar of myself has broken. The ignorance is I'm something. So the ignorance is, staying with the metaphor of the glass jar, the ignorance is I am this glass jar. Look at the beautiful sari I've wrapped it up in. Look at the title I've stuck on it. Doctor, lawyer, CEO, president, rich one, head of that. Look at how I've decorated it. That's the ignorance. And then one day, if you're lucky, if you commit yourself to a spiritual path, the jar breaks. And then you realize, oh my God, that jar itself is what was keeping me from realizing the truth of who I am. I was looking at the glass around it without realizing that the stuff in it, that air, was exactly the same as the stuff around it. And here I was, so attached, so identified with my little 8-ounce thing of air, without realizing that if I allowed the ignorance to drop, if I allowed the identity to shatter, instead of having 8 ounces of air, I'd have all the air. So when we say, I am nothing, when you say it in truth, it's, my glass has shattered. And so the I am nothing is the exact antithesis of low-grade depression. It is ecstasy. It is the, oh God, I'm nothing. Because I am merging into everything. So when we talk about self-love as a practice, it's not a practice of loving the jar. It's not a practice of, because the problem is the jar is going to have good days and bad days. There's going to be some jars that are more beautiful than it is, some jars that are less beautiful than it is, some jars that have even more air, that are bigger than it is, some jars that are smaller, some jars that are shinier, some jars that are less shiny. And so if we focus our self-love on saying, wow, you did such a great job today. You made 100 sandwiches for the poor, or you wrote this project and it got accepted and your company merged with another company and you made $2.5 million for your company today. Or you're so smart, you were the one who understood this problem, figured that out. Or you're so good because you wrote that really generous check to the charitable organization. You're so good because your sari was the most beautiful. You're so good because your kids were the best dressed and best behaved at the party. You're so good because you learned more Sanskrit mantras than anybody else learned Sanskrit mantras. You're so good because everybody else had to change their legs in the meditation. You didn't have to change the cross of your legs in the meditation. Right? I mean, we use so many different ways. We sadly even co-opt our spiritual practice into the workings of the mind. But it's important that our self-love not be rooted in any of that, because then when the day comes that you do have to change the cross of your legs, or maybe 2 or 3 times, maybe you've got some cramps in the legs, maybe you didn't sleep so well, maybe you hurt your knee, whatever it may be, maybe you didn't do so well in the office today. Maybe you had an off day. Maybe you're having a fallow season. Then suddenly there's no soil for that self-love to grow. And so it has to not be rooted in the jar, not rooted in what you do. It has to be rooted in the content of the jar. The self-love is love of the content, which is divine. And that's where self-love and love of God go together. It's where self-love and love of others goes together. Because until and unless I realize that which fills me, my content, the content of my jar is the same as the content of your jar, I can't actually love you. I can say, oh, you've painted your jar really nicely, shiny. But that's not loving you. So this physical body, this identity of titles and careers and finances and achievements and all of that is just decoration on the jar. And the self-love comes from realizing, wow, I'm actually made up of the same stuff as God. God lives in me. I'm made up of infinity, of eternity, of love, of truth, of consciousness, of all of that. That's what I'm made of. And yeah, I've got this jar thing around it. And I tend to identify as that. And when I identify as that, I make mistakes. Because self-love, by the way, is not delusion. Self-love does not mean thou art perfect. And it's important to realize that, because we do have minds, and our minds play games, and we do have egos, and our egos do drag us in the wrong direction. And we do have ignorance, and that ignorance does lead us to make mistakes that have ripple impacts, that impact and affect others negatively, and ourselves negatively. So self-love is not thy jar art perfect, but it's thy content is perfect. And the more you can get in touch with content, so realize the core of who I am is divine, is pure, is perfect, is whole, is complete. And all of this suffering that I'm feeling and that I'm bringing to others, all of this judgment of myself, of others, is just ignorance. And I'm not going to do that anymore. Because if God wanted me to be any different, God would have made me differently. Right? It's God after all. And so even with my imperfections of the jar, of the body, the mind, the ego, the identity, the actions, the habits, the behaviors, even with the imperfections in that, the core of who I am is perfect. And so my goal becomes a goal of constantly just returning my mind to the perfection of who I am at the core, rather than being focused on the ignorance on the surface. And this is what the spiritual practice does for us, is it enables us to connect more and more with the truth of who we are. When we say Aham Brahmasmi, I am God. When we say Soham, I am that. When we chant all of these simple mantras that remind us, I am divine, it doesn't mean, and that wasn't wrong for me to cheat on my taxes. And it wasn't wrong to yell at my kids, and it wasn't wrong to hurt someone's feelings, and it wasn't wrong to do that. It's not that. It's not Aham Brahmasmi, therefore every word that comes out of my mouth is perfect. Every action I do is perfect. It's not that. It's the core of who I am, the truth of who I am is divinity. Let my attention be focused on ridding myself of the ignorance that makes me think I'm this bones and skin and muscles and blood and history and chemistry and electricity and this thing I call a brain that feels like a mind, that feels like emotions, that feels like me. Let my attention instead be focused on the real me that's not determined by the electricity and the chemicals in my brain at that moment. And that's where the self-love comes. I'm just going back to the truth, going back to the truth. And the last piece of that is when you make a commitment to love the self, you have to also commit to having enough discipline to do the things you tell yourself you're going to do. I always say it's better not to commit to something than to commit to it and day after day after day refuse to do it. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to be perfect. So if you're going to commit to not getting angry, and you used to get angry all the time, and now you get angry only sometimes, well, that's great. You're improving. But if you're going to commit to getting up every day to meditate, and you never do, stop committing. Tell yourself you'll meditate at 3 p.m. instead. There's no wrong time to meditate. I mean, yeah, there's much more powerful times of the day to meditate. That's why we get up early in the morning. But the point being that the destruction on our sense of self, by telling myself every day I'm going to do something and never doing it, is much more destructive than not getting up to meditate. So if you commit that you're going to do something, make sure you do it, because otherwise what ends up happening is our whole self-identity becomes, oh yeah, I'm the type of person who says I'm going to do things that I don't do. And then it becomes very hard to keep loving ourselves. I'm the person who always promises, but never does. And that's not congruent with the self-love of our spiritual being. So be careful what you commit to. You can certainly say, I'm going to try to get up and do it. But if you actually say, I'm going to, if you make a resolution that you're going to do something, if you commit to doing something, do it. It makes self-love easier. Having self-respect, we spoke in the last question about going from tolerance to respect to acceptance to love. If I'm going to love myself, I have to accept myself, which means I have to respect myself, to tolerate myself. And if I don't respect myself, it's very difficult to love myself. And so we have to make sure that we stop acting in ways that we don't respect, because that's going to keep you from finding that self-love.